So what does it mean to discharge a contract? Because that's what we need to talk about now. There are several different methods, ways to discharge a contract. But all we're really talking about is how to terminate. Discharge means to terminate a contract. So let's take a look at it. There are several ways this can take place. Now, the first way is performance, which is obviously the preferred way to terminate any contract. But performance just means all parties have fulfilled their obligations. On a real estate contract, obviously we've closed. So both the buyer and the seller have done everything they agreed to do. So they performed their responsibilities. Well, once we've closed, performance has been completed. That terminates the contract. There's nothing else left. So that's one way. Another way is just through a release. Could the buyer ask the seller to get out of the contract? Maybe, and I will tell you, this is more common than you might think, but a lot of times buyers, they'll make an offer, they're now under contract to buy the property, and then they just get cold feet. Or maybe they just decide, this is just not the right property for me. So they want to get out of the contract. Well, they could request the seller to just release them from the contract. And assuming all parties agree to the release, then that terminates the contract. There's no longer an obligation of either party to perform. But another way is through what we call rescission. Rescission and release do the same thing. We just talked about release, but rescission will do the same thing. It terminates the contract as long as both parties agree to it. But you need to understand the difference. There is a difference between just a release and a rescission. What it's saying here under rescission, assuming both parties agree to it, when the seller agrees to rescission, what they're telling the buyer is this: I will release you from the contract, from the obligations of the contract. And furthermore, I will allow you to go back to the position you were in prior to entering into the contract. Now that's significant here, because if we just agree to a release, all the seller is saying here, I will release you from your obligations to perform. In other words, I'm not going to require you to buy the property. But with a release, the seller is not allowing the buyer to go back to their position before the contract. But with a rescission, they are agreeing to let the buyer go back to the position they were in prior to the contract. Now, why does that matter? For the most part, it matters because of the earnest money. Y'all say the buyer put up $1,000 earnest money. Earnest money is some amount of money the buyer will put up at the time they make the offer. And typically, if the buyer defaults, does not close, then they lose that earnest money. In this case, say $1,000, the seller would get it. Well, in this rescission, because the seller has agreed to allow the buyer back into their position prior to the contract, obviously who had control or who had the earnest money prior to the contract being agreed upon? The buyer. The buyer still had it. So that means, so all that to say this: with a rescission, the seller's agreeing to release the buyer from their obligation to perform under the contract, and I'll let you keep your earnest money. Now, if they just agreed to the release, obviously the seller saying, I'll let you out of the contract, but I'm keeping your earnest money as liquidated damages. So both release and rescission will terminate the contract. Either one will do it. The question is who's going to get or keep the earnest money. So if it's a release, if that's what the parties agreed to, the earnest money goes to the seller. If both parties agree to a rescission, then the buyer will get their earnest money back. Now, obviously, if what they agreed to was a rescission, then it says here the courts will not recognize the contract as legally binding. In other words, because when you agree to the rescission, you're agreeing that both parties would go back to the position they were in prior to the contract. So anything that happened while it was under contract, y'all, is null and void because you agreed to the rescission, so there's nothing legally binding at that point. All right. Another way to discharge or terminate a contract is through something called accord and satisfaction. Now, to do this, it's also going to require another term that you see here called a novation. Y'all know, if you recall, we talked about novation in the financing chapter as well. But novation just means substitution, where something is being substituted for something else. Well, in this case, with the accord and satisfaction, this is where both the buyer and the seller just agree to terminate the existing contract and replacing it or substituting it with a new contract. Obviously, probably different terms and whatnot. And you can do that, again, as long as both parties agree to it. So accord and satisfaction means you're terminating the current contract and replacing it with a new contract, which would also require the novation, which means just one contract is now being substituted for the other. That's what we're talking about there. Okay. And then, it also talks about the statute of limitations. Obviously, if one party is in default, that could create some legal issues, potentially lawsuits. And when we talk about statute of limitations, and I would assume most, if not all of you, are familiar with this or heard of it. But that means the law says if someone has caused you damage and you're thinking about suing, filing a lawsuit over the damage, then you have to do it within a certain amount of time. And we're not worried about right now how much that time would be, because when it comes to the statute of limitations, that could vary from state to state and from circumstance to circumstance. Okay, so there's not just a set time. But whatever that timeline is, the law says that's your statute of limitations. I'm just making this up, but say it was 6 months. Well, then you've got 6 months to file your lawsuit. If you don't do it within that time frame, then you've waived your rights. Your statute of limitations has expired, and you can no longer take legal action. That's all they're talking about there. And then lastly, another way to discharge a contract is through assignment. Assignment means, let me give you an example. Probably easier to explain it this way. But say a buyer makes an offer on the house, seller accepts it, it's now under contract. I will tell you, this is something investors have done quite extensively. They do it quite often, where once they get the property under contract, and typically they've got it under contract for much less than what the property may actually be worth, or what it might actually appraise for. But let's say they got it under contract for $150,000. Well, the house might appraise for $180,000. So the investor that now has it under contract might start looking for another buyer that would be willing to buy the property, say for $170,000. So obviously the new buyer would still be getting the property for less than what it might appraise for, and the first buyer is actually making money. In this case, in this example, they'd be making $20,000. Well, to do that, they would have to assign their rights or their interest over to the new buyer. I will just, and you'll see some of the terms I'm getting ready to talk about here in a little bit. This is not in your book right now. You'll see it later, but let me go ahead and see if I can explain it this way. When the seller accepts an offer, that conveys what we call equitable title to the buyer. Okay? Now, so at the moment the seller accepts the offer, the buyer now owns equitable title to the property. Now, they don't have legal title, and they will not get legal title until they close. But you cannot go to closing and basically purchase the property without having equitable title. You've got to own the equitable interest or equitable title before you can go to closing to get legal title. Okay? So there's a difference between equitable title and legal title. Again, we got another chapter coming up on titles, deeds and titles and stuff like that. But anyway, so at the time the seller accepts the offer, what interest does the buyer now own? Equitable title or equitable interest. So when they go to assign their rights over to another party, another buyer, what are they assigning? What are they transferring? The equitable interest. So if I assign this over to another buyer, then that new buyer now owns the equitable interest, right? So when we assign something, you can only assign something that you actually own. If you don't own it, if you don't have it, you can't assign it. So obviously I can't assign them the legal title because it hasn't closed yet. But I can assign them the equitable title because that's what I currently have now that the property's under contract. But when I do or sign the assignment, and I assign it to someone else, then that terminates my interest. Any rights that I did have is now terminated. The new buyer now owns all of it. So those are the different ways you can terminate or discharge a contract.